On tonight's episode of Werewolf Encounters, our focus is on 7 scary and true encounters that generally take place around the Dowagiac area in Michigan. Michigan is already known for their dogman sightings, so you can expect this episode to be just as hairy and frightening. Many residents of the town believe something is lurking around Lake Dewey that looks like a red, shaggy wolf. Are they seeing a dogman? Let's find out. Story 1. Back in summer of '75, I lived with my aunt in Dowagiac, Michigan, a quiet and peaceful little town for the most part, until you realize there's something more sinister that lurks around the local lake of Lake Dewey. On this particular day, we had just gone raspberry picking and thought it would be an excellent idea to wind down for the evening by having a nice picnic by the lake together. I was 15 at the time, and my aunt was in her 30s. She was a recently single woman and actually just divorced. Her ex-husband had cheated on her and was extremely abusive. Looking back, I'm so glad she got out of that relationship. It was lovely for her to have my company over the summer since we were pretty close, and I grew up with her around even as a little boy. I always enjoyed spending time with my aunt. This particular day, though, was scorching hot. I do remember that. We were just getting settled in from having a picnic when my aunt was looking out from behind us, asking me why a large dog was watching us. I was confused and turned around to see what she was talking about. There, in the woodline, was what looked like a German Shepherd crossed with a wolf, standing upright on 2 legs, glaring right at us. It was just behind the tree line a bit, with what looked like one hand holding onto the tree in front of it, as if to lean on. It was in the evening, so there was enough light for me to fully see what it was. I could see it pretty well. If I had to give my best guess, I would say it stood at about 6 to maybe 7 feet tall. Very shaggy looking, slender, but still lean. It had a longer than normal muzzle, longer than what a wolf or even a German Shepherd would generally have. What we were looking at was the most bizarre creature my aunt and I had ever seen. I knew some people walked their dogs in this area, but this didn't look like any dog I'd ever seen in my life. After a few moments, it lowered its head down just a little bit, and then it bared its teeth at both of us. My aunt and I were terrified. But just as quickly as it bared its teeth, it promptly popped its head up and turned in the direction to our right. You know how when a dog hears something and they're curious, their ears pop up, right? Well, that's what happened here. It perked its ears up while looking off and then looked back at us and bolted into the woods. We didn't even see where it went. It left so quickly. We had a lot of friends that frequented the area, and we never heard of such a thing. It was only later in life that I learned about the Dewey Lake Monster and other sightings that occurred around the lake. Looking back, I'm not sure if it maybe was signaled by another one of those things, but I'm glad it left when it did, and I'm glad we left when we did. Story 2. September 5th, 1962. 3 men, all locals from the nearby town of Sumnerville, had come up for one evening for a barbecue and were hanging around Dewey Lake, specifically the south side. Patrick Farrell, Timothy Shipman, and Stanley Tavares were sitting around the fire enjoying some good times and some drinks when an unknown creature reportedly attacked one of the men. Patrick and Timothy both stated this. This thing just came out of nowhere and grabbed Stanley. It pulled him back into the brush, and he was gone. We were scared and didn't know what to do, so we called the authorities, but they called us crazy and began questioning us in his disappearance. Stanley Tavares was later found unconscious only 400 or so yards away with minor cuts and bruises. When questioned about what happened and how he got there, he didn't seem to remember what happened, and the last thing he said he remembered was hanging around the campfire. Whatever grabbed him looked like some giant hairy dog thing that tries to pull him into the woods. It made it far enough past the brush that we got out of there and called the police, Timothy said. Stan's personality changed dramatically after that incident, and he never entirely was the same person again. Whatever happened to him, whatever attacked him, did something to him. We never went back to Lake Dewey again, and Stan cut off all contact with everybody else around him. Story 3. July 1st, 1962. Paul Ruiz and Mary Ruiz were frequenters of the local areas of Michigan, including such places like Sister Lakes, Lake Michigan itself, and of course, Lake Dewey. They often had a knack for exploring and those kinds of things. Seasoned outdoors type of people, if you will. What they experienced was something neither could explain. We were sitting there on the beach of the lake, taking in the scenery, when we saw what looked like to be a dog about a few hundred feet out swimming. We weren't sure if it was somebody's dog that they let loose, but we didn't think much of it until it started swimming closer in our direction, Mary had said. This dog was bizarre. As they both got a closer look and it got closer to us, we noticed it was a lot larger than what we originally speculated, and it wasn't quite swimming as a dog would. It was paddling more like a human would if they were to try to imitate how a dog would swim. As it got closer to roughly 70 feet away from us, I could begin to make out much more terrifying details, Paul said. Paul then went on to describe how it locked eyes with both Paul and Mary and began swimming even faster. Paul and Mary were both very nervous by the entire situation and decided to get out of there quickly. Their car wasn't too far away, luckily, so they got up and ran back to their vehicle. As they looked back and saw what they believed to be a dog at the time climb onto the shoreline to only stand upright as a man, scared them to death. When it stood up, that was it for me. It looked like a giant hairy man with a German Shepherd dog head on it, Paul said. Paul went on to say, "What startles me is I've had friends tell me about the supposed lake monster, but I always wrote it off as a story that our parents would tell kids to keep them from staying out late at night. I never in a million years could have been convinced of its existence until that day. Now I stay far away from anything around that lake." Story 4. June 2nd, 1981. Marvin Pierce encountered something truly bizarre one evening, driving back to his home in Sumnerville. His father had lived out in Dowa-Gyak and was visiting for the evening before heading back home. Heading out of town, he ended up going down Dewey Lake Road. This road and the area are already pretty creepy, with thick swamp on both sides of the gravel road. At the time, this road was still unpaved, and so you had to go fairly slow. It was past dusk, and there is only a glimmer of light left in the sky at this point. It was roughly around 8 or maybe 9 p.m. As Marvin was driving down this road, he saw what appeared to be some giant, hairy thing stepping out into the road in front of his vehicle. Because it's a gravel road, I'm going slow. It's also dark out, so I'm doing about 20 miles an hour. This thing walks out in front of my car, and so I immediately slow down. This thing turns in my direction and immediately charges my vehicle and attacks it. I'm about 20 feet away from it when I come to a stop, so when it charges me, it was right up on me in seconds. It smashed its hands down onto my hood, and not only bent the metal, but damaged my engine just from sheer force of impact. I slammed it into reverse out of sheer panic and spun out in the gravel, causing my vehicle to whip out to the left and almost flip the entire car, Marvin explained. By the grace of God Almighty, I was able to turn the vehicle around and kick it into high gear to get the hell out of there. I've never done 50 on a gravel road ever, except for maybe this one time. For whatever reason, after this thing attacked my car, it didn't seem to follow my vehicle, and it must have ran off after I reversed and swerved dramatically. I never did look in my rear view mirrors to check, and I'm glad I didn't. I never saw the creature's face because it all happened so fast, and I'm not sure that I ever want to. He said his vehicle was so severely damaged that he broke down only a couple miles away. He said his tires were pretty torn up from doing that speed on the gravel, and that he was leaking all sorts of fluid. Story 5. Summer of 1970. I've lived in Dowa Gyak for many years, and when I was younger, my younger sister and I, along with our friends, used to play in the area all the time. That only lasted for so long before we saw the grass man, as we like to call him. Being children, you always joke about monsters and things living in the lake and the woods and getting you, but we never thought it would be a reality. I believe they called this creature the Lake Dewey Monster, although at the time we just called it the Grass Man. We weren't sure what it was, and no one had seen it that we were aware of. They were just stories from neighbors and townspeople. I remember one afternoon we were all playing outside, and my little sister and her two other friends Thomas and Joel were to go down by the lake and play for a little bit. Earlier that day, I had tripped on a rock and hurt my ankle playing. My ankle wasn't broke or anything, but it definitely was pretty sore, and so I told them I was just gonna sit this one out. I went home and just played inside while my little sis and our friends enjoyed their time at the lake. This was obviously back in a time where kids could go outside and play without having to worry about creeps as much, so no one would really bat an eye why that this girl's 12-year-old brother wasn't there watching her. I was sitting inside with my parents gone at work, and my little sister runs in the house screaming, saying that she and Thomas and Joel ran into the grass man. She told me that they were down playing by the lake, and that this tall, hairy dog creature came out of the brush and tried to grab one of them. She said they all screamed and ran for their lives. My sister likes to joke around a lot, but I believe she wasn't joking about this incident. She was bawling hysterically and hyperventilating, and was genuinely terrified. It took me about 2 hours to get her calmed down enough to where she could calmly explain to me what she experienced. I told her not to tell our parents because they probably wouldn't believe us. After that, she was very apprehensive about going back down by the lake, and when I tried to talk to the other two about it, they just refused to even speak. I have since gone down to the lake several times, and I've never encountered anything weird. As I got older, I had other friends that claimed they had experiences down there too, with very similar descriptions, but again, I've never had anything personally happen to me. I don't know if the grass man truly exists, but I do believe that something tried to attack my sister and our friends that day, back in the summer of 1970. Story 6. A fishing expedition had gone wrong, where a fisherman was almost dragged to his watery grave by the suspected Dewey Lake Monster. What I find most terrifying about this is that there was already a very similar account back in 1963 with an R.J. Lutz who was fishing and thought he had come upon a log, only for it to end up being a monster, and stood up out of the water and walked off. Having something so similar happening 26 years later tells you whatever beast RJ originally encountered that day still roams the area. This happened on Lake Dewey itself by a young fisherman who was 22 at the time named Dennis Taylor. He had gone out one morning to do some fishing all by himself. Not too long after that, he made it out of the center of the lake, and he felt something underneath his boat. Whatever it was had bumped the bottom several times. Thinking it was a floating log, or maybe even a fish, he began to investigate, and when peering over the side of his boat, this hairy creature shot out of the water and grabbed onto his boat, not only capsizing his boat due to the sheer force and weight of suddenly hanging onto the side, but also launching him into the water about roughly 10 feet away. After landing in the water, he quickly resurfaced, only to find his capsized boat and no creature around. Terrified, he frantically swam towards the shoreline, but felt something grab at his ankle and try to pull him down. He submerged for some time and claims at points he was pretty sure he had lost consciousness, but was somehow able to free his legs enough and make it to shore. When reported to the police, he explained his story, and they wrote it off as him drinking or him being on drugs, or maybe even accidentally tipping the boat over. Who knows? When asked to describe what he saw that came out of the water and grabbed onto his boat, he said it was a red, shaggy dog-looking thing. He said he wasn't sure why it was there or what it was, or mainly, why was it underneath his boat in the water? But he said it had hands just like a human does, and each finger had claws on it. Story 7. October 3rd, 1966. A couple of young fishermen, David Rothwell and Jeremy Hinn, were camping on the south side of Lake Dewey one early fall evening. They had gotten there from South Bend, Illinois the day before and planned to fish there for perch the following morning. It was a long drive for both of them, and so they had decided to set up a small tent and a campfire and relax at the lake. They wanted to take things easy since the next day they had planned for a full day of fishing and hopefully get a decent haul to take back home. They had their tent set up and had just started a small fire when one of them decides to walk down to the water to check it out further. Within moments, the one by the fire mentions to the other that it smells awful. They described the odor like a wet dog mixture with rotting meat. It was so strong, and neither of them could quite tell where it was emanating from. We were there right by the lake, minding our own business, when this odor of wet dog and rotting meat hit us right in the face. It was so sudden, and we had no idea where it was coming from. One moment, everything was fine, and then the next, this smell, it's like it just appeared there, said David. Not even a moment later, David began to hear weird growling noises and heavy breathing right behind their camp. They both turned around to this huge, hairy dog beast charging at both of them. We didn't have time to react. We both hightailed it right into the lake, clothes on and everything. When you turn around and a 500-pound animal is charging you from less than 50 yards away, you're gonna move, told Jeremy. The two jumped into the lake, expecting this creature to follow suit. Both turned around after jumping in and noticed the animal was nowhere in sight. Then they heard a large splash about 30 feet away from behind them. Something humongous had just jumped right into the water. Both men could only assume the worst and swam as fast as they could back to a different part of the shore and retreat to their van, leaving behind all of their supplies and fishing rods. This thing was trying to bait us. It not only bluff charged us into the water and toyed with us, but then it must have gone around to the brush to our right and jumped to the water. We were terrified, and so we swam back to the shore as fast as we could. We didn't know what we were dealing with, and we didn't want to find out, Jeremy had said. We left out of there in a panic, and unfortunately left all of our gear behind too. We got out of the lake soaking wet, jumped into the van, and got the hell out, David said. We went back for our stuff the next morning. As much as we didn't want to, our tent was entirely destroyed. It looked like it had been attacked or mauled by a grizzly bear. We really didn't feel like contacting the police and risk looking like crazies, so we just cleaned the incident up ourselves and left it at that, said Jeremy. Both men have not been back to the area since. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I have tons more true encounters coming from all sorts of creatures and the likes. Stay inside, lock your doors and windows, for they are coming. Be ready. This happened to me in July of 1985. I was living in Kentucky at the time in an undisclosed location. My family has owned property that's been in my family's generation for a very long time and is surrounded by a bunch of wilderness. Let me give you a lay of the land. In the front of the house, it's open yard and our driveway, which is roughly 300 yards and leads to a gravel road. To the left side of our house is our vegetable garden, which is roughly about 16 by 20 feet. And then I would say about another 100 yards of open pasture, followed by a wood line. Behind our house is probably about 20 to 30 feet, and then more wood line. Now, the wood line behind the house keeps going and connects with the wood line on both sides of the house and the pasture. There's also about 100 or so yards of pasture on the right side of the house as well, and then again, more wood line. About 50 yards out on the right side of the house, past the vegetable garden, I have a small tool shed where I keep all my stuff. One night, my wife and I were inside eating dinner, and it was roughly 8 p.m. I remember because it was still sunny outside, but the sun was just starting to set. I started to get a really ominous feeling, and I noticed the hair starting to stand up on my neck and arms. Now, I should note that I had the windows open for a breeze, and out here in Kentucky, you could really hear the wildlife. I noticed that it was really quiet outside as well. Something wasn't quite right. Of course, I wasn't going to tell my wife, so I just brushed it off and continued to have dinner. When not even 5 minutes later, I hear this bang crash sound by the shed. From where I'm sitting, we have a window in which I could perfectly see the shed and the garden. Even in the dusk, I was able to make out and see that there really wasn't anything visually out of place, which I thought was odd. I decided to go grab my .22, which I keep by the door, and go investigate. I just remember walking over to grab my rifle, and right as I put my hand on the door, it's almost like my instincts kicked in, and my entire body just told me, don't go out there, whatever you do. It was the strangest sensation I've ever felt in my life. It's as if I was frozen in fear. So I sat there for a minute, and I waited. I didn't hear anything outside that wasn't normally there, and it continued to stay perfectly silent. So much so that you could hear a pin drop. Now, my wife is freaking out because she senses it too, and I go and I decided to close up all the curtains and lock all the doors. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I just felt in every fiber of my being that it wasn't safe to be outside. Me and my wife decided to go in our bedroom and try and get some sleep for the night. I remember closing my eyes, but there's no way me sleeping was going to happen anytime soon. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is my wife waking me up and hushing me. In a panicked whisper, she was telling me that there's somebody outside of our window. Now, where we live, I know that's impossible since we are miles away from our nearest neighbor. I turned to look over at the window she was pointing to, and just like out of a horror movie, I see the silhouette of a wolf standing upright in our window. The moon was definitely out that night because it was illuminating this thing, whatever it was standing outside the window. It had sharp pointy ears with little tufts of hair on the top of its head, and its entire head was massive and shaped like a wolf. Now, something to note is that our window is like 7 feet off the ground, so this thing had to have been tall and standing to even get its head in the whole window view. And we have those really thin curtains, you know, the ones that cover your window, but just enough to where you can't see anything outside. But if something were to stand in the way, you could definitely make out a silhouette. It wasn't even more than 5 seconds until I first saw it, and that started growling. And it was so deep and guttural, I'm honestly surprised I didn't urinate on myself right there. And then it reached out with its hands and started tapping on the window like it wanted us to let it in, like it wanted us to know we were out there, like it wanted us to know we were vulnerable prey. At this point, my wife is entirely hysterical, and I run out of the room to go grab my rifle from earlier. I run back to the front door and grab the gun, not caring what my instincts tell me, and open the front door to run outside to the side of the house where this thing is. It takes me maybe 5 to 10 seconds to run out to where the window is, and it's nowhere to be seen. I'm looking all around our house, and I want to go back inside. Of course, I don't have a flashlight with me, and the only lights are coming from inside the house, and the porch light, which is just barely illuminating where I am on the outside. I stood outside for a minute or two, looking for this thing, and I didn't see anything. What freaks me out is my hair was still standing up, and the forest was still super quiet. After about a minute, I walked back in the house and checked up on my wife, who is still at this point hysterical, and I asked her what had happened. She said it just left. Her and I weren't really sure what to do at that point, so we just sat there and waited for this thing to come back. It never did the rest of the night, and I don't think her and I fell back asleep until maybe 5 in the morning. Obviously, this was a long time ago, but that was the only time I've ever encountered such a beast. I've never encountered anything like it since, and I hope I never do. I live in Ohio and have ever since I was a little kid. I am now in my mid-30s, and just a couple of years ago, I went camping with my now wife and heard things that I cannot explain. We went on a weekend camping vacation on one of the Great Lakes, actually, and every single night near our tent, we would hear these strange sounds. The first night, we were awoken to a really low growl of a rumble. This growl was honestly the most guttural I've ever heard and sent vibrations through both of our bodies. If this was a predator making this noise, it had definitely had to be a huge one, and had to be the size of a tractor. It would go on and off for a few hours, and then it just stopped. The next night, we kept hearing what sounded like a woman screaming or being murdered, not even a few hundred yards away from our tent, and it circled all around us all night long. I've heard people talk about the Michigan Dogman and other things like that, and even people seeing sightings and reports of this general area, but I've never actually seen anything myself. After that camping weekend though, and after hearing all the strange noises and knowing the general wildlife that lives in the area, I can't be so certain anymore what's actually out there and what actually is not out there. My name is Gray, and I have owned property out in Tulsa County, Oklahoma for the majority of my life. My parents had bought it when they were really young, and it's since been passed down to me. So when I die here in the next 20 to 30 years, I'll pass it down to my kids or my grandkids. I had a very strange experience a few months back. Before I continue on with my story, let me kind of give you an idea of how my property looked. We had a small one-story house, followed by pastures on all sides of the house. Past the pastures was woodline, but these pastures were pretty large. I'd say at least a few hundred yards in each direction. Not too far from the house was my chicken coop. It was a beautiful, quiet evening in April, and it was starting to get dusky outside. My dog Cinderella, who's an old lab and has been my faithful companion for all these years in this house, started acting funny. She started whooping and hollering and whining and growling out the window, looking over at the chicken coop. I told her, "Quiet, old girl. There ain't nothing out there that's gonna get ya." That time went on, and she just got more and more anxious, and finally, she started erupting into a continuous barking with her hair standing straight up on her head, and at that point, I said, "Doggone it, what's going on with you?" Her gaze never left the coop. I figured if there's something going on, she would pick up on it, and this made me uneasy. She went back to ferociously barking, and then went really nervous again and started pacing around. It wasn't even a minute before she ran out of the front door towards the coop. Since it was a nice day and evening out, I left the front door open and the screen door open to let all the airflow come through. My dog goes running towards the chicken coop, and now I'm freaking out. I go running after her, and I'm not even 30 feet away from this coop at this point, and I see this. The only way I could describe it was a classic werewolf. I see this werewolf stand up from behind the chicken coop, and my dog immediately stops in her tracks and just starts cowering. This thing was mostly black with tufts of gray and brown that looks like it ran through its fur, but it had a mane almost like a lion and really sharp pointed ears. What terrified me the most is the way it looked into my soul with its piercing yellow amber-like eyes, like it was observing me and watching what I do and move. It didn't show any signs of aggression, nor did it lift or move any of its body other than just standing up and staring straight at me. After what felt like an eternity, it literally just turned, dropped down to all fours, and ran off towards the wood line. At this point, I was freaking out and ran back inside with my dog, so I can barely even get to move. I locked all the doors and windows and then realized that if I called the police out here, they're never going to believe me. I've lived here for a long time, and so if my parents and I have never encountered any such thing, now I'm worried that my chickens are in danger. I didn't know what I could possibly do besides lock up my windows and doors. Wish me luck. I'm going to take this into my own hands. So, a little bit about me. I'm in my early 40s and I adore the outdoors, and have been doing it all my life with my father. Him and I have been hunting, fishing, hiking, and exploring the woods together for as long as I can remember. He's right, and I've learned everything from him. He's a crazy old man too, and he's still going, even at 67 years old. Me and my dad experienced something together hiking that we both can't really explain, but we both have a really bad feeling about it. This happened to us when we were hiking around the woods of Mississippi in the National Forest of October 2010. Since him and I have been out in the woods together so much, there's really nothing that we're not prepared for or afraid of. Being avid outdoorsmen for well over half of your life, you come to a point where you kind of run into everything the woods has to offer you, or so you think. I'm still not sure exactly what me and my father saw that day in October, but I know it wasn't natural, and I know it was something that wasn't supposed to be there. We had gone hiking for the day and were probably about 3 to 4 hours into our hike when we reached an area in the forest that kind of dips down, almost kind of like a ravine, but only by about 20 or so feet. In this steep, though, was a very large open space where trees didn't really grow, and it was just a clearing. Now, this clearing stretched for probably about 100 yards to maybe another 100 yards. It was rather large. Me and my father stopped at the top of this little cliff and just took in our surroundings and sat for a minute. We usually take a break about every couple hours and have a pretty good endurance, so we're about to start pulling out some snacks and water when we both start getting a really weird feeling. We ignored it at first and started eating, but I noticed within minutes I started feeling it more and more. Do you know that innate fear when you know that a large alpha predator is in the area? That's what it felt like we were being stalked and watched. I spoke up and told my father that something doesn't feel right. We needed to be on our feet and be prepared. When I spoke to him, he was already looking off in the woods, and it seemed like his old eyes were still very sharp because they caught something off in the distance. He didn't reply back to me, but after a few seconds, he calmly said, "Look over there behind those trees," in a hushed whisper. Now, I've been doing this with my dad for a very long time, and as I've already told you, it's pretty rare that my dad gets scared, and when I looked up at him and he had that whisper to me, the fear on his face scared me straight because I knew it was something serious. I looked out and sure enough, behind a few of the trees, you could see a rather large shape. At first, I couldn't quite make it out exactly what it was, so my first instinct was that maybe it was a bear. But we only get smaller black bears here in the south, so it couldn't have been. Whatever this thing was extremely large, and then I went to thinking, possibly a grizzly bear? but it was just so dark, and as I'm processing this, I whispered to my dad, "Is that a bear?" He whispered back to me now that this thing looks bigger. At this point, we had been watching it for a few moments, but it started to come towards us into the clearing. Now, keep in mind, this thing was probably only about 4 or 5 trees into the woodline of the clearing. This thing starts moving toward us, and so we could start to make out more details of what it was. It stopped right at the tree line and just stared in our direction. What we were looking at was some monstrously tall wolf on 2 legs. This thing was built like a bodybuilder, but was so black I couldn't really make out any details of the face, since it was roughly still 100 yards away. I can tell its ears were far more pointed, and its head was enormous. Its arms looked really huge, and it looked to have what looks like hands with claws on them. Its legs just resembled that of a dog's, but thicker and more muscular, and a tapered off waist. I didn't see a tail at all. Me and my dad sat there and just stared at this thing for another couple of minutes. It didn't move. It just stayed stationary, staring off at us. It didn't even make any noises, and I didn't smell anything. I had had enough though at this point. I just told my dad we need to get out of there, and we immediately just packed up our stuff real quick and got out and left. Since that encounter, we actually haven't gone back to that national forest, and probably never will. My dad to this day doesn't really like to talk about it, and I'll be honest, it definitely makes me uncomfortable. I've lived down here in Baton Rouge for the majority of my life, as well as the South. I'm now 29, and I clear away from any swamp exploration like I like to do a lot of. It all started back when me and my friends were just teenagers. We just had a knack for hiking and wanted to explore the swamps and all the beautiful areas around the state. That was all good and gravy for a while, until just about 4 years ago, we came into this abandoned house that was pretty boarded up, along one of the swamps that no one really ever goes to. We had traversed quite a few miles in to where you can't go to, and that's when things started to get a little more hairy. It's crazy to traverse into territory that hasn't really been touched by a lot of people, or so it feels like in a very long time. The house we had found had definitely been abandoned for probably well over 40 years, and actually, to my surprise, had barely any, if all, graffiti, and looked like it was just worn and torn down from weathering for the most part. The doors were missing in, and the windows were missing, but other than that, the structure wasn't too terribly damaged. Being avid explorers, we were wanting to go in and check it out. We first entered into the living room that practically everything was missing from, and the walls were scratched up and torn up. As soon as we stepped into the living room, the thick, sweet, sickly smell of wet dog and rotting meat and blood filled the air. This immediately made me and my buddy really nervous, as we're probably about 7 miles out into the wilderness. Why would there be rotting meat and wet dog around? As we exited the living room down a hallway, the smell was coming from an open door at the end of the hall that led down a flight of stairs into darkness, which would be presumably the basement. As we got to the entrance of the stairs, we shone our flashlights down, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything, and neither of us were really wanting to go down and check it out. It didn't feel right, and already at this point I feel like there was something living in the house. The smell was so incredibly strong at the top of the stairs, it was hard to keep from gagging. It was utterly repulsive. Something was nesting down there in the basement, and we weren't about to go and find out. I think once we really got a really strong whiff of what it was, we kind of hightailed it out of there and got the hell out of Dodge. Looking back on the encounter, I am not surprised some sort of animal was living down there. It's the perfect place. It's secluded by miles and miles of dense swamp and brush all around, and protected by an old structure that had been long abandoned years ago, with nobody bothering you. I think we just stumbled upon the den of something we were never supposed to come across. I can't say that it was necessarily a dog man or anything like that. I honestly don't know what it was, but I can't think of a reason why the pungent smell of wet dog and rotting meat would be so present. This encounter happened to my wife last year while working the night shift and coming home at about 4 a.m. We live out in a pretty rural area, and we have a lot of desolate rural road to get back to our house. As she was driving home early one morning, she had her windows rolled down since it was August morning, and she began to hear something really loud run behind her vehicle. She said it was dark enough that you couldn't exactly make out details, but you could definitely see something, and that there was an outline of something behind her, very large, running and keeping up with her vehicle. This terrified her, as my wife initially told me she thought it was someone's loose Great Dane or something that had just gotten out, and she's terrified of big dogs due to an incident she had with a neighbor's mastiff when she was a child. My wife is doing roughly 40 to 45 down this road, and so she decides to speed it up to about 50, close to 60, and this thing, whatever it was behind her, now is running alongside her driver's side window, and now she's really freaking the hell out. She's looking over at this thing, and she said it looked like the most evil, demonic wolf she has ever seen in her life, and she swears that it looked over and smirked at her in the most menacing, nefarious way. She said it looked a little bit like a hyena crossed with a wolf, crossed with a man. That's also when she told me that she shot it into high gear and sped up to about 80 miles an hour. Now, luckily for my wife, the stretch of road she was currently on was pretty straight, with a minimal amount of curves in it. She said that after a short amount of time, the wolf creature thing stopped following her, and she ultimately lost sight of it. As soon as she got home, she was panicked and pale as a ghost, and was still freaking out and crying. She was honestly a nervous wreck there for a while. She tells me whatever it was just there to scare her, and that she feels like it was so powerful and so evil that if it wanted to get her, it could have. But it just toyed with her, let her know that it was just there as its prey. She still works at the same place and still drives the same route basically because it's really the only way to get to work, but has not had any encounters with it ever since that day. I was driving home late at night, probably about 11:30 or so at night. There was only ever a few other cars on the road. I came across a bend in the road, and as it curves around, something large and black ran across the road, and as my headlights hit it, it looked like a deformed-looking hyena-wolf cross hybrid, or something weird like that. I've never seen an animal that looked so strange, and it looked like it was uncomfortable in its own skin, like it couldn't move properly, and its front legs were longer than its body allowed. It cleared the road pretty quickly though, but it just freaked me out due to the sheer size of this thing. It was humongous, and I've never seen a wolf or animal that looks anything like what I saw. I literally had to slam on my brakes since it jumped right out in front of my car and trailed off across the road. My windows were rolled down, but I didn't smell anything, nor did it make any noise, and I did not see any eye shine. I haven't really told anybody about this since they'll think I'm crazy, but I'm telling you this is exactly what I saw that night. I was driving around really late one night. It was probably 1 in the morning, and I was getting back from a friend's party. Now, the neighborhood I live in is obviously residential, but we're surrounded by a lot of thick woods. There's a long stretch of road, maybe about a mile, and there's thicket on both sides of the road that separates the residential area to another. I was driving this road, heading back to my place, and I probably had about a good 3 minutes until I hit the general neighborhood area. As I'm driving, I noticed some eye shine coming from the right side of the road, but I wasn't quite sure what it was. I figured maybe it was just a deer, but as I started to get closer, within seconds, I noticed it was the hugest wolf head I've ever seen in my life staring up at me from the thicket. What scares me is we don't have wolves around here, and the thicket and bramble is pretty tall, and so for this thing's head to be above it would have to be well over 8 feet tall. As I get closer and drive past it, all I literally saw was a giant wolf head staring at me through the bramble, or at least its head sticking out. What's weird is I've looked up other dogman encounters and other reports about having glowing eyes, etc. But these eyes were just normal eye shine like you would if you were to shine your headlights on a deer. It just didn't feel right though. The head was too huge, and there's no reason any wolf head should be 8 feet off the ground in the middle of thorns and bramble at night. It still gives me the creeps to think about. Oh, and I'm sure it doesn't help too that we're surrounded by a lot of thick woods in the entire area, so there's that. Plus, there's many deer that traverse, so this thing would have plenty of food to use. This encounter happened to me back in 1979 in El Paso, Texas. This was back in my early 20s when I lived out there. I later moved on out of the area and stayed for reasons of employment, and I'm glad I did. What I encountered that night still gives me nightmares to this day, and I will never go back. In my early 20s, I reached a pretty good spot financially due to my uncle getting me into real estate and doing it with me, and so we were making pretty good money at it. So I was just a single guy, no wife, no kids, just living by myself, living the typical bachelor life. Well, one thing I loved to do was take morning walks, and I would walk about 5 miles every morning to stay in shape. I love adventure though, and would usually hike outside of town. This particular hike occurred at Mammoth's Trunk Trail, a little ways out of town. This hike is pretty rigid with a lot of rocks and hills, but after making my way a little bit through is when I had my encounter. I got up around 4 or 5 in the morning and began my walk. I had done this trail before, so at one point or another I had veered off the path quite a bit, and after being about a couple hours into my hike, I needed to relieve myself naturally. I'm standing there behind a very large stone, pissing on the ground, when I begin to hear a really low growl, and it sounds like it's coming from about 10 feet away from me. I looked over my shoulder, and literally, not even 10 feet away, standing there, is the largest wolf I've ever seen in my life. At this point, I just urinate all over my foot as I'm frozen in fear, looking at this wolf that's literally the size of a buffalo. This thing had piercing amber eyes, and its teeth didn't even look right. They were really large, and it kind of had a hyena look to it, like if you went to cross a wolf with a hyena. I honestly thought it was going to attack me and kill me, but then after a couple few seconds, I heard the voices of some nearby distant hikers, and immediately this thing looked over with its ears perked up, kind of like how a dog does when he hears something. As it looked over, I looked over to the nearby voices and I was hearing, and I looked back towards the wolf, and it was gone. I didn't even see it leave. Apparently, these other people who I was hearing and also veered off the path in the same direction I was conveniently, and they were maybe only about 100 feet away. The way sound travels in this area is strange, and they sounded much closer, which I was actually hoping for. After pissing all over my own foot and leg and losing all the good in me, I ran out to these people and told them they needed to leave and that there's a really large predator in the area. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I sat there trying to convince them of what just happened to me, and they seemed like after some time thought I was genuine enough to convince them. So I don't know what happened back there, if that was a dogman or what. Whatever it was wasn't standing up, it was on all fours, but I know wolves don't get to that size. I'm not sure if it was a direwolf or not, but it was literally the largest predator I've ever seen in my life. It was easily the size of a lion, if not bigger. This encounter happened to me just a few years ago when I went camping with my brother, my dad, and my uncle out in Wisconsin in the Necedah National Wildlife Refuge. For those of you who aren't familiar with the area, it's basically a giant bog with a variety of other trees like aspens and oaks, etc. The wildlife is pretty extensive and diverse too, with all sorts of birds and critters, so we knew going into it that it's probable we would run into something, but not like something we actually did encounter. My dad always keeps a rifle on him, and we have flares and other forms of safety equipment and tools to ward away potentially threatening animals. We usually do since we enjoy camping a lot, and it's just good to be prepared. We're actually residing in Texas at the moment and live down there, but our uncle lives up here in Wisconsin, so we like to visit him every year up here and do a big hiking trip together. Now, this camping trip began for our usual spring break week-long camping trip. We hiked into the bog about 6 or 7 miles and decided to set up camp. Usually, what we'll do is our first day, we'll hike for about 5 to 10 miles and set up camp, and then spend the next few days exploring the area and hiking before we move camp and venture even further. We came to a really nice little clearing next to a rather large swamp. Even being in March, it was still pretty comfortable to be in. We set up camp, cooked wieners over the fire, and drank beer, and then crashed out for the night. All I can say is I'm glad this happened on our first night before we got too far into the swamp. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night to some noise in our camp and some scratching on our tent. At first, I thought it was another camper going through our stuff, but I realized we were quite a ways out in the middle of nowhere. There's no way somebody is out here going through our stuff. It sounded like a large animal, and I know the bog is home to many and much variety of wildlife, but I could hear this thing breathing and wheezing. Whatever it was sounded huge and bipedal. It sounded at times like it was stomping around our campsite, but then it would just stop for a moment and then growl really heavily. Think of like a wolf's growl, but magnify that times 100. You could literally feel the bass of the vibrations through your body. For some strange reason, my brother, my father, and my uncle must have really drank a lot because they were passed out hard. Of course, I was the only one awake while this was going on, and now I'm freaking out in my sleeping bag. It's pitch black outside, and I don't have a firearm or any weapon to access directly. It wasn't even a second later that this thing comes right next to the tent, and I could hear it not even 2 feet away, growling and breathing. It was so terrifying. The best way I can describe it to you is it literally sounded like there was a lion that was 3 times its normal size right outside of our tent, snarling and growling. It stood there for a moment and then paced around our tent a couple times, and then all of a sudden, as soon as it came, it left. It wasn't until after it left that I noticed the noise in the swamp started to come back. Now that I think about it and look back, while that thing was stomping around, all noise outside of our tent was pretty much pin drop silent. Even though this whole thing only lasted maybe 10 minutes at most. I feel literally traumatized and I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I explained to my uncle and my brother and father the next morning when it happened, and they chalked it up to me just seeing or hearing a really large wolf or some other large predator in the area and thought it would be in everyone's best interest to pack up and leave. Even though they didn't necessarily believe what I had to say, I did appreciate though that they at least kept in mind safety precautions and were at least convinced enough that there was some large predator out there in the area that they were unaware of. If you're ever in central Wisconsin, stay out of the bog. There's nothing in there for any of us. To this day, I can't say for certain exactly what it was, but I know it had sinister intentions. I've been born and raised close to around Ann Arbor in Michigan my entire life and have never encountered anything weird or out of the ordinary. I'm an avid hiker and outdoorsman and have seen it all when it comes to wildlife. I know much of my teenager years and early 20s was riddled with tales of the supposed dogman that lives out in the wilderness, but I have never encountered such a thing, or at least I thought until more recently. This happened to me just a month ago. I'm still having a harder time processing exactly what happened. I usually like to hike and traverse through miles and miles of wilderness. As I'm hiking through the woods, I just had this odd feeling that I'm being watched, and it's making me more and more uncomfortable as I go on. I continuously look around and check my surroundings, but I don't see anything. After a short amount of time, maybe not even a half hour later, the woods start to get silent. Now, for those of you who aren't exactly outdoors people, this usually happens when there is a large predator in the area, like a mountain lion or of the such. The only thing I can think of, though, would be a black bear, which is the only really kind of bear there is in Michigan. But I seriously doubt a black bear would be stalking me like this. I've also dealt with black bear in the past, and I've never had an experience anywhere close to what I was having with any black bear. I continued to track on back to my truck, having only gone about 3 or so miles into the woods, and that's when I started to smell the sweet smell of death, rotting meat, and wet dog. It was so strong. At this point, I definitely start picking up the pace, and I began jogging back to my truck. I knew whatever I was smelling couldn't be too far away, and as soon as I start jogging, I could hear this thing keeping up pace with me, whatever it was. It couldn't have been more than 20 yards behind me. I pretty much refused to turn around and look, and I literally kept my pace all the way until I made it to the tree line and ran to my truck, and I got the hell out of there. What's weird and also scares me at the same time is that whatever this was, I'm sure could have easily gotten me and taken me out, but it didn't. It just kept pace with me, like it was trying to shoo me off of its territory. It's really going to affect everything now, from the way I hike to where I hike. I guess there's just some things in the wilderness we were never meant to discover. My encounter takes place when I was 19. When I was a little younger than that, my parents split up in a really nasty divorce, but always stayed about 5 or so miles within each other, so that way me and my brother would be able to go back and forth and maintain a good, healthy relationship with both parents. We lived in a smaller town, so a lot of the times we would just walk to the other parent's house. One of the most popular ways we would do this is walk the dike to my dad's house. To give you a little bit of an idea, there's a dike that runs all the way up to the upper part of town where my mom is, to the lower part of town, which is a few miles away. Now, you can take this little pathway, which is right next to the train tracks and a river. This pathway is called a dike, and as you're walking there, there's about a 20-foot clearing on your left-hand side, followed by the woods. On your right-hand side is a little bit of a drop-off by maybe 5 or 7 feet, followed by some train tracks, followed by more brush, followed by the riverbank and then the river. This pathway is pretty long and extends for a few miles, and there's really only seldom few streetlights here and there that are out there. On this particular night, me and my brother, who were 19 and 16 at the time, are walking from my mother's to my father's down this dike. It's roughly about 8 p.m., if I remember correctly. It was definitely dark out, so it wasn't summer yet. Keep in mind we're the only ones out walking this right now, and this is pretty common for us since we walk this dike often, and we know that it's fairly low traffic. On this particular night though, we were walking and we start hearing some strange noises by the riverbank. It's not really that uncommon. Sometimes homeless people and younger kids like to go down there and drink and party, so we didn't really think anything of it. But the noises we did hear sounded like a horse or something that large was trapped and trying to get out, or something like that. I really don't know just how else to describe it. It was just very strange, but all I can make out was that whatever was making this noise was humongous. Again, I kept walking and didn't really think too much of it until about 50 or so feet away, this large thing runs up from the train tracks all the way to the dike, right underneath the streetlight. It ran up on all fours, and as soon as it gets onto the pathway, it stands up on 2 legs and looks directly at me and in my brother's direction. At this point, me and him stopped dead in our tracks and practically pissed ourselves. My brother and I both said werewolf and almost a cry whimper, and I stayed dead silent watching the thing. This thing stood there for about a moment and just stared at me and my brother, and then took 1 or 2 leaps and jumped into the woods to our left. This thing was enormous. At first, I thought it was a wolf or something, but then as soon as it climbed onto the path, I noticed it was the largest dog I'd ever seen. And then once it stood up, I didn't even know what to think anymore, other than a werewolf. It wasn't super ripped or anything, but it was pretty lean and had a more slender, tapered off waist, and I did see a tail that was quite bushy. The head was pretty large and looked very wolf-like. Imagine a timber wolf. And I could see under the light that it had pretty dark brown hair with certain streak patterns that were unique. The scariest thing about it, though, was the way it looked at us. It didn't snarl. It had a sinister smile on its face, like it wanted us to come to it so it could do evil. Its eyes were almost a piercing red. Even now, the story is really hard for me to recall because of just how traumatizing it was for both of us. Even though it only stood there and glared at us into our soul for probably not even 10 seconds. It felt like forever, like it had done what it wanted to do, like it wanted to terrify us and that its mission was complete. As soon as it turned its head and left into the woodline, me and my brother sprinted towards my dad's house. We got there and told him what we had saw, but of course he didn't believe it. He just thought we saw some homeless person or something. Of course, leave it to mom and dad to never believe what you have to say. Me and my brother to this day don't talk about it, and just like to pretend that it never existed. That to me feels like the easiest way to cope with it. My one and only encounter with a werewolf, or so I would call it, was back in 2011 when I was 16. I live kinda out in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, and it's pretty rural out here. I think the closest neighbor is probably a mile, and there's a lot of woods around our property. But I've never had an issue with that before. Anyway, it was a school night, and I was playing some video games before I went to bed. So this is probably roughly 9:30, if I remember correctly. My room isn't the largest, and I have a window that's right next to my TV, so I could see directly out my back window as I'm looking at my TV. So I'm sitting there, and I'm playing my Xbox, and I have a pretty normal, about 5 or so feet off the ground window, and the curtains are open. It's obviously pitch black outside. I see 2 large ears pop up. At this point, I'm only really half paying attention because I'm like, what the fuck? Did some large dog wander by our yard? And then, not even a couple seconds later, the whole head pops up into view, and at this point, I'm screaming like a little girl. This was a huge looking wolf-like face with a massive head that took up almost the entire span of my window. It had the most terrifying looking amber eyes, and it was baring its teeth at me. I think what blew me away the most was how big its teeth were, even though they seemed to stick out of its mouth even when it wasn't baring its teeth. It wasn't making any noise, but after I screamed and stared at it for a few seconds, I ran out of my room and ran to my parents to let them know there was some sort of evil dog outside my window. Of course, my dad thought it was some animal, so he grabbed his rifle and went to check the situation out. But there were no tracks or any signs of an animal had been outside my window. I now keep my curtains closed for the most part. This sighting happened to me back in 1981 in Northern California. If I remember right, I think I was either 11 or 12 at the time, and we lived on some property with acreage out in the middle of nowhere. There's actually alfalfa fields all around where we lived. Our driveway, which is pretty long, I want to say at least 500 to 600 yards, extended out from our house to the road with alfalfa fields on both sides. Now, right around the pathway, there are quite a few trees. Big fir trees to be exact. There was one evening I was taking the trash cans out to the very end of the driveway, just dragging them. It's a huge pain in the ass, but I had to do it every week. That was my chore. Anyway, I got both cans to the end of the driveway, and as I started to walk back towards the house, I immediately felt danger, like something was after me. For whatever reason, I don't know if it was instinct or like this creature wanted me to know it was there, but I just happened to look up to my left in the fir tree. And in the fir tree, on a branch, was this hyena-looking creature. That's the best way I can describe it. The face looked very much like a hyena. As soon as I looked at it, it was looking right at me already. And it's not all that happened. It started to lower its head and growl as if I was prey. Apparently, it wasn't too fond of me discovering it was there. After about 3 seconds, the thing jumped from the tree onto the road, and then jumped into the other side of the road where there's pretty much nothing but thick forest and brush. It was pretty dusky out since it was the evening, so the only real thing I saw was how large it was, and then that it was a pretty dark color. Maybe like a dark brown, closer to black. It looks like it had some kind of mane, but it was really hard to tell any specific details with how it was holding onto the branch. The branch that was underneath that was a huge thick arm, and it was a part of one of the lower branches that was roughly 20 feet up. I'm still baffled how that tree held on to such a large animal, and I have no idea what it was, but obviously after seeing, I ran back to the house and never told my parents what I saw. Are they really going to believe that I saw a hyena creature in the trees? Probably not. This encounter happened to me as I was on my way through central Minnesota when I was younger, and me and my buddies used to go on hunting trips together all throughout the country. It was October at this time, and we were around central Minnesota during this time. And actually, we were right around the Mustinka River. Now, to give you a little bit more understanding of the area, there's not really a whole lot of trees around, just a lot of tall grass and brush. We were driving through the area, and it was late at night, so it was pretty dark. We were on a long stretch of road, and about 100 yards ahead of us, we see this giant mass jump out into the road, look over in our direction, and then jump to the other side of the road. When it jumped, it paused for a second and looked our way. We were far enough away that we couldn't make out every detail, but we definitely saw more than we ever wanted to. This thing looked like a human-wolf hybrid. It was very shaggy and had raccoon-like hands from what we saw. It wasn't really built huge either. It was very, very lean, but also very tall. Looking back, I can't really make out a lot of other details of the face and head, other than it looked like a giant brown wolf head. I do remember, though, that it had longer muscles, but I didn't see any teeth or anything like that, or even glowing eyes. Once this thing hopped to the other side of the road, we didn't want to take any chances running into whatever this thing was. So, we floored it and got the hell out of there. Me and my buddy have done a lot of hunting together and have not really ran into anything weird like that. People have even mentioned to us about Bigfoot stuff out there that we go and have never found any tracks or even any real proof that it exists. I'm not saying we ran into a werewolf. I'm not saying we ran into a creature. It was just some large animal. Maybe it could have been an unknown dog? I'm not too sure. I wouldn't want to be caught alone with what we saw, though. I will definitely say that. I went camping with my wife and 3 children in a national state park in Northern California back in 1989. It's been so long now, I forget the name of the exact park. I had a very terrifying experience that is hard for me to recount sometimes, just due to the feeling like I've acquired some sort of PTSD from it. We had done some hiking and fishing for the day, and we're driving our camper into the national state park. We found a nice spot to pull over and get nestled down for the night. Everything went pretty normal. We went outside and we brought out the grill and had some burgers and just enjoyed the cool air and relaxed. After it got dark, we all decided to head in and get some shut-eye. Now, my children at the time were very young, 2, 4, and the oldest being 6. And of course, it makes it a little more scarier because it was a full moon this night, and so much of the area around our camper was actually illuminated by the moonlight. After falling asleep next to my wife in our bed, we were awoken at some point in the night by our 6-year-old daughter knocking on the door, saying there was some really big dog outside looking in the windows. I immediately just told her she was dreaming and to go back to sleep, but she was very persistent and sounded scared. I told my wife to stay in bed and then I would get up and check it out. I got up and walked outside. I didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary. I didn't smell anything or even sense anything strange. I went back inside and told my daughter that there's nothing to worry about and that she should settle down. As soon as I told her that, whatever it was must have slammed as hard as it could into the side of our camper, because the entire thing shook like somebody drove headfirst into it at about 40 miles an hour. It knocked my daughter and I off of our feet, and my wife and younger children woke up and crying and screaming. The only thing I really had with me as a weapon was a baseball bat. So here I am in my pajamas, running outside with a bat, thinking somebody ran headfirst into the camper. I get outside to only experience total silence and the most eerie feeling I've ever felt. I'm not sure, for whatever reason, it was instinct or what was telling me, but I knew to turn to my right because I felt something was close by. I turned to my right, and sure enough, standing about 20 feet away from me, was the largest thing, animal, whatever you want to call it, I've seen in my life. This thing was standing at least 10 feet tall. It was enormous. I never really watched horror movies or was into that sort of stuff. But if I had to tell you what a real-life werewolf would look like from the movies, this was it, in the living flesh. It was so massive. Its body was like you took Arnold Schwarzenegger, covered him with black hair, gave him piercing yellow eyes, and long claws. It was darker since it was night, but like I said, the moonlight allowed me to see more than what you normally expect on a night since it illuminated so much. It was so black, it was like it was absorbing the light around it, so I couldn't see a lot of the finer details, like muscle definition. But I could see humongous teeth, and what looked to be a giant dog head on top of this abomination of nature. I immediately threw down my bat and ran back inside and locked the camper door. I wasn't sure if that would even hold it out, but I told my family to huddle down and to be as quiet as possible. I really kind of lost track of time after that, because all I remember is this thing pacing outside of our camper and growling every couple minutes. It never once tried to open the door or get into our camper. After a while, the sound seemed to dissipate, and I never went back outside to check if it was still there. The family and I eventually found our way to sleep, and we left the very next morning. I'm not sure what it was, but it's something I really don't like to talk about, and even writing this out was tough for me. I would honestly prefer just to forget about it forever. I'm an Idaho native and a retired police officer. Many years ago, when I was working as an on-duty cop, I had a strange occurrence happen to me that I was told I'm not allowed to talk about. But I feel now that I'm older, it's something I should mention before I pass. The rest of the force thought I was crazy, but you know what? I don't care. You can't explain what happened to my vehicle. It was probably around midnight, and I was on the 41 between Sturgeon and Spirit Lake, when the only thing I can describe as an extremely large wolf began running alongside my vehicle and showed extremely aggressive behavior. I began to speed up, and I immediately radioed I had an unknown animal chasing my vehicle, and whatever this thing was slammed into my car and scratched the whole side of it with whatever claws it had on it. I sped up even more and eventually lost track of it. But as I went further and got far enough away, I pulled over to the side of the road just to check the damage on the vehicle, and you could see long and deep scratch marks all along the side of the vehicle. I called for backup, and when they arrived, they weren't sure what to make of the whole ordeal. These are claw marks as big as grizzly bear claws, and there ain't nothing out there that's going to chase my vehicle at midnight and do that to the metal of the car. The next morning, I get a call from my supervisor who explicitly told me to never speak about it and do not tell anyone about it, even though at that point I'd already told almost the whole force what had happened. This happened back in 1992, and although I didn't understand the circumstances of the time, I'm older now and I've looked into these kind of encounters. Some things I realize why now they keep things hush-hush. Pay attention to where you are and your surroundings, especially at nighttime, because even when you're an officer, things can still be dangerous. I live out and have lived out in a very rural area for most of my life without any issues at all. Where I live, there's a lot of clearing around my house, along with woods and a cornfield not too far away. This piece of property that I live on has actually been passed down from my grandparents, who originally settled here and built the house a very long time ago. I think since about the early 1900s. It's been fairly peaceful here, with a handful of farming and easy country life living. We stay out here and like it a lot because there's not really a whole lot of critters, and you get away from the busyness that is the city and everything that comes with it, like noise, crime, and people. Unfortunately, I'm learning out here it has its ups and downs too, with the odd things that have been happening. Only up until very recently, I've been experiencing some strange noises outside my house during the nighttime, but nothing that's really got me alarmed. One evening, I noticed some strange noises going on. It sounded like a bunch of growling, but I know there's really no other dogs in the neighborhood besides mine, so I thought that was strange. I go to look out my sliding glass door, and I see my Labrador barking his head off at this massive wolf human thing that was standing right by the cornfield. It looks like whatever this thing was had just stepped out from the cornfield into the clearing, and my dog was literally flipping shit. At this point, my dog is literally snarling and going crazy, and this thing is just standing there. Keep in mind, they're only about 20 to 30 feet away from each other, if I had to guess, and so now I'm freaking out because this thing looks mean enough to easily kill my dog. There's still plenty of daylight outside because it's starting to get dusky, but I could still see details. This thing had a massive, shaggy wolf head and a very lean, tapered waist, but it was very defined and very muscular. You could see it breathe, and even though it was shaggy, I could very much so make out the muscles on its abdomen and chest. Not quite ripped like a bodybuilder, but still very well built, and this thing had to have been pretty heavy. I can't really estimate what this thing weighed, but I guarantee you it could put some pounds. It looks like its arms were too long for its body though. I remember that and thought it was strange. After a moment or two of watching this go on and not really sure what to do myself, This thing bared its teeth at my dog and got ready to attack. This thing sent my dog into a full frantic frenzy, running back to me whimpering, and as my dog was running back towards the house, this thing looked up over at the house and just stared at me through the window. I began to panic because I thought, what if this thing comes toward the house? What if it comes after me? What if it comes and tries to hurt us? But it never did. It just sat there and stared at us for another moment or two before turning around and going back into the cornfield the way it originally came. Even though it was roughly 100 or so yards away, I felt like it was staring into my soul, and that this being looked highly intelligent. I've never seen anything like it before, but I feel like it was more than just some unknown animal that we happened to run across. I thought it was some alpha predator, but for whatever reason, it seems more curious about my dog than it did threatened. It moved pretty quick too, because literally, within just a few seconds, it was long gone, and those cornfields are not really easy for traversing. After this happened to me, I decided to do a little bit of digging online, and I was surprised to find out how many other people have had occurrences just like mine with very similar beings. I'm honestly surprised I didn't have a more aggressive encounter. Even though the thing bared its teeth at my dog and was going to strike, it was very, I don't even know what you'd say. It just studied my dog at first, very curious, until it got ready to strike. But I'm very thankful and I'm counting my blessings. I still haven't seen any trace of it since then, and hope maybe it was just passing through the area and will leave me the hell alone. I live and have lived out in a very wild, rural area in Mississippi. I've lived out here just about my entire life, and I love it. I wouldn't change a thing. Waking up to the birds chirping in the morning and having all the wild critters around my property is one of the best things ever. I've never had any issues with predators attacking my livestock or anything like that. But lately, there seems to be a different story. In my area, I have probably about 6 or 7 other neighbors, and we're all fairly evenly spread out. All of my neighbors have livestock from horses, chickens, goats, cats, and dogs, you name it. My closest neighbor, bless her heart, has a couple pet raccoons and possums. She's almost 80 years old and will bring any animal into her house as her own. Lately though, some of her animals have been turning up missing. The neighbor on the other side of my property, a little further out, has been finding his chickens and goats mutilated. He's lost about 10 goats this past couple years, and well over a dozen chickens. There's really no big alpha predators in the area that would literally entirely mutilate an animal like this. It doesn't make any sense. These livestock aren't even being eaten, just torn to shreds. These animals look like they've been thrown into a meat grinder and emptied out into the ground. Like I said, I haven't noticed anything strange with any of my livestock, but I do keep a close eye out. One early morning, I was going on a stroll through some of the acreage that's behind my property, as I like to do from time to time. I noticed things kind of seemed out of place with how quiet it was. Usually, in the early morning, the forest is pretty alive with bird noises and little animals scurrying about. That wasn't the case this morning, though. Even though the sun was shining bright, it was still dead silent. I don't know too much about hunting, but it was pretty unnerving, to say the least. Not too far into the acreage is a small little lake. This thing isn't too large, maybe the size of a football field at most. So sometimes it's nice to be able to go back there and sit at the bank and just relax. That's where I was planning to go this morning, and even though I felt extremely uncomfortable with the total silence, I just did my best to ignore it. It only took me maybe about 5 or 10 or so minutes of walking before I made it to the clearing, or where I could clearly see the entire lake. I stopped to rest for a minute and just take in the view. Things seemed a little bit more eerie than they did just a moment ago. Things were still silent, and I started to feel the hair on my body raise up. I became very alert, like something was around, but I wasn't sure what. I suspected maybe a mountain lion was around, and I was being stalked. Just then, across the lake in the woods, I heard some crashing noises that sounded like a moose was stampeding through the woods. I was very puzzled by this, and within a second, I see this large, upright canine step right out of the woodline, take maybe 5 or 6 strides, and walk back into the other side of the woodline. Across the lake from me was another clearing that this thing walked into, but this clearing wasn't large. On one side of the woods, it was maybe about 30 to 40 feet where the other woods started, and that's where this thing walked into. All I could really see from where I was at was this large, gray wolf that was upright, just walking. I was more confused and puzzled than I was scared. I wasn't sure what to think, and so later on that day, I visited my neighbor and let her know what I saw. Beth, the one who has a ton of animals, told me that she didn't want to say anything because she didn't want anybody thinking she was crazy. But she has seen the same animal, the same large gray, upright canine on her property going after her livestock. Her husband had passed a long time ago, so she really had no means to chase it off or really defend herself. There's all sorts of unknown animals in the woods that we haven't discovered yet, and as long as it keeps its distance from me and my property, there won't be any problems. Back in 1990, I was living in Kane, Pennsylvania, where I worked with my wife's family, helping her father get his startup business going. Life was pretty normal for the most part, and even though I'm not really a country living type of person, I do enjoy where we live. Kane is a pretty small town, and so it was pretty simple living for a lot of the time. One evening, though, I was headed outside of town on Highway 6, headed east. I don't quite remember where I was on the road, but at some point, I was frightened when this large canine steps out onto the road, off to the other side of the road. It was later in the afternoon, but not quite evening yet. It was brown in color and had legs like a man. They did not bow back like a regular dog. It was weird. The head was enormous. It looks like a giant German Shepherd. I thought it was a person in a suit at first because of how bizarre it was. And never once did it turn to look at me or anything like that. It just continued off and didn't pay attention to me. I didn't see any eye shine or anything. I didn't even see any teeth or anything, but I did notice its longer muzzle. It happened so fast I couldn't really recall what its hands looked like. Its strides were so big, I knew there was no way it could have been a person. At first, I thought it was a man in a suit or something, like I said, or maybe somebody was just playing a trick, but it looked just too realistic, and I'm still trying to convince myself that it wasn't what it was, but I feel like I know for sure it was what it was. It was also 7 or so plus feet tall, and that I can't really wrap my head around still. It was about 50 feet away when it came out onto the road and crossed, so I only slowed down a little bit. It was an amazing sight to behold, and even though I was a little fearful, I've talked to other people around town to see if they've seen anything weird or bizarre, and no one really talks about anything. My wife and her family have lived in this area for a long time, and they've never had any encounters with such an animal. Who knows? Maybe I just got lucky and got to see an animal nobody really else gets to see. It was only a few years after that we moved up to Maine and still live there. I've been back to Kane quite a few times since and have yet to see or hear anything like it. Idaho gets pretty flippin' hot in the summertime, especially depending on where you live. I've lived south of Boise now for about 5 or so years, back from 2008 to roughly about 2013. And it is such a breath of fresh air from the hustle and bustle of the East Coast. I used to live down in Tampa for a long time, but have since moved here for a change of pace and a different job field. Of course, moving out here, I never thought I would encounter anything like what I did, since living in Florida, it's pretty vanilla. I think I've heard about the skunk ape once or twice growing up, but have never given it any real thought. I've always just thought that stuff was made up. Anyway, it was May. I remember that much, and it was back in 2013, right before I had to move. And this particular night was pretty hot. I lived in a one-story house at the time, and my bedroom window is roughly 4 feet off the ground. My bed sits right next to my window, so as I'm laying down, I could literally reach over with my arm and close or open the window. Now, when I bought this house, it needed a bit of fixing up, and the windows all needed to be replaced. I fixed most of them, but they were still needing screens, and so of course for me, I hardly have ever opened my window, so I never really bothered putting a screen in. It wasn't quite hot enough for air conditioning just yet, so on this night, I thought, what the hell. I cracked my window a little bit and fell asleep. Well, it wasn't enough. I woke up sweating balls about 1 in the morning. I know because as soon as I woke up, I looked right up at my clock, got up, got some water, and then opened my window more because it was pretty hot. I didn't just open the window, I cranked that son of a bitch all the way open to let the cool air in. And for whatever reason, my room decided to just collect all the heat in the house and hold it in. I had a rough time falling back asleep, but the outside air was so nice and cool, it felt really good. I remember faintly waking up to the sound of heavy breathing and thought I was just half awake, half dreaming, so I brushed it off. I noticed the heavy breathing started to get louder and louder, and I started to feel like something wasn't right. I opened my eyes and looked in the direction of the heavy breathing, and outside, approaching my window about 20 feet away, was a werewolf. That's the only way I can describe it to you. It had glowing red eyes, and it had its teeth bared and claws out reaching for the open window. I screamed as loud as I could and jumped up and slammed the window shut. I quickly ran in my kitchen to grab a knife, and I prepared myself for an all-out war. I don't think I've ever went back to my bedroom. I just sat there, huddled on the kitchen floor, waiting for this monster to break in my house and get me. I was prepared to fight for my life. It was pretty quiet though, and nothing happened after that. I think maybe an hour or two later, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I know, I'm waking up from the fetal position on my kitchen room floor with the knife still in my hand. I jump up and I immediately run back to my bedroom, and I see my window is still closed. Nothing disturbed. I run outside my house and search around where this thing was last night, and I find these humongous prints in the dirt. They were huge, easily 12 inches or more. I had a friend growing up who had a few Great Danes, and this paw print would dwarf even their paw prints. I thought to myself, great, I have a werewolf in the neighborhood. There's really nothing I could do or anyone I could talk to after that. Who's gonna believe me? To my luck though, I ended up getting a really good job offer roughly 3 hours away, closer to northern Idaho, and not even 2 weeks later, so I ended up moving. I'll never know what became of that creature, and I feel sorry for whoever ended up moving into that house. I hope they don't have the same nightly visitor that I did.